The conflict spiral, the idea kind of came about, we were trying to explain a puzzle, if you will, which is that no family, I really believe this, no family that's in business together sets out on this journey. They love each other, whatever. They don't set out on this journey expecting to sue each other or never speak to each other again. Right. So this is not something that people are doing intentionally or wanting to do. It's not an outcome that anyone set out to do. And yet it happens. We see those examples of families that are in lawsuits, or they're having these kind of significant recurring conflicts that are destroying the business or the family. And so we really want to try to explain how that happened. And I think the most important insight, and the reason the spiral is kind of a helpful way of getting at that, is because it's important to understand that it doesn't happen all at once. It happens through different steps. And there's 7 steps that we identify and talk about how family conflicts tend to go through these and go from relatively minor disagreements to these major conflicts. And so really, it starts at the very top with understanding that the simple thing that causes conflicts to start down the process is interests start to diverge. What I mean by that is, going back to an example of someone has 2 kids and someone has 3 children. In our generation, we might have divided everything 50-50. It all worked perfectly well. We get down to the next generation, and maybe of that 5, some are working in the business, some are not. Some might be really reliant on dividends, others might not. And so all that's happened is that we have interests that are no longer the same. We want different things. And then the next step that tends to happen is that we harden into positions. So those broad things about, I want to be able to take care of my family, I want what's fair, get really crystallized into an us versus them battle. I want higher dividends, you want lower dividends. I want more reinvestment in the company, you want less. And once you get into that positional bargaining or positional conversation, communication becomes very difficult. And so communication, either we have it out, we have an argument, we don't talk to each other, and then, we're having those recurring back and forth conflicts that are really unpleasant. So our ability to have that conversation in a constructive way just, is no longer possible. And then what happens next is that those conflicts tend to extend from, one versus one, if you will, one person versus another, into a broader disagreement among the family. And we talk about that as alliances start to form. And usually it's because I might say, well, look, Karen, I know you're a really unreasonable person. You're not really willing to have a constructive dialogue about this topic. But I know that there's this other person in our lives that listens to reason and can probably talk some sense into you. So I'm going to recruit them into this conversation. And I've tried to solve the problem, but in many ways, what I've done is to broaden it and make it worse. And then once we get into this mode of having different alliances, it could be one branch versus another. It could be one generation versus another. It could be those that are inside the business versus those that are outside of the business. That's when we're starting to get into the conflict taking on more serious tones. We talk about first, what tends to happen is that we have proxy wars, which is, I'm not quite ready to have a full-on, disagreement, lawsuit kind of thing, but I really want to send you a message. And so I know that there's a employee that you're really close to, but that happens to report to me. And so I'm going to fire that person. And you're going to get the message, I hope, that I'm being very serious. And you better start to take my concerns seriously, or we're going to have a real problem. The next step is that people start to bring in advocates, usually lawyers, but maybe it could be someone who's a valuation expert. I think I'm not getting a fair deal on my shares, I'm thinking about selling them or so on. But then what happens is that we brought in people into our conflict that are going to take one side or the other, and whose actually responsibility is to advocate on behalf of one or another. And then we're basically right there on the verge of the last step, which is the family war. It could be through lawsuits, or it could be through some other function. And so what happens is that it's not like the conflict starts going from, I disagree with you about this topic, to I'm suing you. It actually goes through these different steps. And one of the things that we find really helpful for families to do is to look at that spiral, to look at those 7 steps in it and say, where are we? And one thing that's really important to realize is that there is a gravitational pull of the conflict spiral. It will pull you down if you don't do something to try to get yourself out of it, because each of those steps that we talked about kind of makes sense at that moment, right? If I think I'm not being treated fairly, it makes all the sense in the world for me to bring in someone from the outside who's going to look at things from my point of view, right? I try to do the right thing, but in the process, I've now introduced an advocate that just makes the conflict more entrenched and more difficult. So that's really the key thing about the conflict spiral, is to understand where you are, to understand that left to its own devices, the situation is likely to get worse rather than better. And if you want to really address it, it's not going to be a small change. You're going to really have to figure out how to get yourself outside of this whole dynamic that can just take over how families are dealing with each other.